many of us face immense challenges in our lives. I want to uncover secrets and principles to building a life filled with purpose, not weighed down by hardship. I'm Kirsty, your host in this journey. Each episode, I'll be talking to different people, sharing their stories and practical steps to help us to design a life that we love. Today's guest is Christiansen, an award-winning filmmaker who built his brand around socially responsible films that educate, inspire, and heal. His films are anchored around the idea of truth, of healing, hope, through authentic storytelling, clinical support, and cultural commentary. Eric is also the survivor of his own trauma after losing his home and all of his personal belongings in the Santa Barbara Painted Cave fire disaster. He's used this experience to understand trauma, the resilience of the human spirit, and how hope is important to the healing journey. Eric, welcome to Let's Talk Life Design.
Thank you, Kirsty. It's awesome to be here, and it's awesome to talk to you all the way in New Zealand from California.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? I love how the world's got us connecting all over the place. Yes. Tell us a little bit about your story. What's your backstory, and tell us a little bit more about this house fire.
Well, let me rewind all the way back to about second grade.
Okay, yeah, that's a little bit.
And don't worry, we're not going to get too into the detail there, but it connects. In second grade, when I was about 7 years old, I've been making films my whole life. And I made my first movie with a script. And I remember somewhere between 7 and 10 years old, making these films, I had some sort of message to tell, but I didn't know what it was. I'm like, wow, this feels this like kind of spiritual. This for a kid that age, it wasn't really spiritual. I just had this feeling. So fast forward, I've been in the industry of making films and editing and shooting now for, professionally since I was 13.
Oh, wow.
And so I was an editor and cinematographer. I went to California Institute of the Arts in the 80s with a lot of the guys that are running and doing Pixar right now. And so we had what we call the Cal Arts Mafia coming out of there. And I learned a lot of different types of art, not only my filmmaking, but I was exposed to a lot of different kind of crafts and things like that. So, but coming out of there, that's when I became, professionally employed full time as an editor, cinematographer, and a lot of my work before this fire that came along and my big change and my epiphany, basically, a lot of my work was kind of flashy. I didn't feel I had connected with myself, but I didn't know it at the time. It was all music video. It was all commercial work and everything. Then what happened is, I had quite a successful career too. And then what happened is June 27th, 1990, the Painted Cave fire in Santa Barbara, California came along, and it took my house, and along with it, over 400 other homes.
Oh,
and
wow.
I was kind of left with nothing material. All my films from way back in second grade that I did in 8mm and everything, that all burned up.
Oh, what a
and
shame.
all my yearbooks, all that stuff was gone.
Yeah.
So, and it took several months for me to kind of figure out what that really meant for me. And it was part of my process, but it was very devastating at first. I was sharing a great home in the foothills of Santa Barbara. My mom had the upper part of the house. I had the lower part of the house. And it was, it was pretty idyllic life. But even at that time, I was not drinking. I was drinking way above a social level. And I was quite the party boy. And then the fire hit, and that changed everything. And really what changed is I got really angry after the fire, and I started drinking at the fire. My drinking and drugging really took off because I just had so much inner, it was losing your home in a fire. It is trauma. I'm not claiming I have PTSD or anything beyond that, but it is a traumatizing event. But it's also the trauma I caused myself in my abuse of drugs and alcohol. And I really got to the end of things about 7 months later, when it got to the point where I really couldn't drink enough to get drunk, and I couldn't not drink. And so
Right.
that was my own personal hell. And the woman that's my wife now, it was around Christmas time, she'd had it with me. She handed me this card to this guy, and his name was Don R. And he goes, go see this guy if you're done doing what you're doing, if you're feeling sick and tired of doing what you're doing. And that next day I did go see him, and he had an outpatient situation for people that are alcoholics and addicts. But more importantly, he gave me this book, and I got involved with an outside group, a spiritual group of other people like me. And 7 months later, you know, I had my last drink on January 12th, 1991, and my first sober day was January 13th, 1991, and I've been clean and sober now for 28 years.
Oh, wow.
And
Fantastic.
that's that. From that point of view, I could start to look back and see what the fire was, and see how it affected me and brought me to this point where I didn't have any kind of earthly things left, or any earthly devices to fill me up or help me out. Yeah.
Were you drinking and doing the drugs as a coping mechanism? Like, was that your way of dealing with what had happened?
Oh, fully. And it was just, I was already, looking back, I was already probably what I would define as an alcoholic before, but after the fire, yes, it was my coping mechanism. I didn't have any idea. I couldn't see my future too well at that point.
Yeah. So what was the big change for you? What was that defining moment?
I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. I got so spiritually depleted at that point that all I had left were kind of my earthly relations with other people and nothing else. And those were coming apart. And inside I was coming apart, and I had a spiritual malady. I was completely drained.
Yeah.
And as soon as I realized what the fire was, that it was a chance to literally wipe my slate clean. You know, all that stuff was gone. Everything's all brand new in a way. And especially now with sobriety, looking back on it, I had the full second chance. So I made what seems to almost be a conscious decision to really pursue my calling, which is helping others, and get sober and use, like what I said when I was 7 years old. What was my message? Well, my message became how to survive something and turn it into a plus, into what seemingly was calamity now becomes a gift for somebody else. And so that's what happened and I didn't know that's what was going to happen. You know, I'm just like this little baby, newly sober, wandering around, and I go, hey, I went to the American Red Cross centers, and I did that whole thing because I needed to. We were renting with no insurance. We didn't have much.
Yeah.
But what I found out in dealing with other survivors, we had this language, and I looked at some of your history. I'm sure you understand this. There's a certain language you have, particularly with somebody from the same disaster, but a certain language survivors have that you can connect. And trying to go outside that circle, they didn't really understand. And as a filmmaker at the time, I'm like, that's a really interesting thing. I would love to try to do a film that would kind of reflect this story that we have in unison, all of us as an aggregate surviving this, and how we all cope. It's all different, but it's all the same.
Oh, wow.
And so that's where I did my film Faces in the Fire. Out of total naivete, I'm like, oh, we can do this. And that was my first personal film. And the exciting thing about that is we showed it at the anniversary of the Painted Cave Fire, the first Painted Cave fire anniversary. And the people in the film and myself, it was a huge healing tool. But not only that, but the community that was able to see it. I saw this healing all around this film. And it went on to show on TV and everything, and won my first Emmy Award, which was really exciting. But what was even more exciting is the National Institute of Mental Health here picked it up as a healing tool that they would show to counselors that are going into disaster situations, what to expect and how to deal with disaster survivors. And that was like my first kind of entree into, not only are my films meant for the public, but they have a huge clinical value. And so all of a sudden I'm thinking, wow, I found that. You know, when I was 7 years old trying to figure out what my message was, I kind of found my message, and then each film progressed from there in style and trying to portray that message and get it to a wider audience.
Wow, and is this a film that people can watch today? Is it available online for people who are overseas, or how do we watch this film?
If you want to see Faces in the Fire, you can go to my website, well, everybody knows it's www. I'm sorry. They can go to my website, ecproductions.com, and there is a link to Faces in the Fire, and it's available on YouTube if you search it.
Okay, brilliant.
So, but it's man, it's 28 years old now.
Yeah,
but
I think the messages don't change regardless of time. So I'd love to ask you, what were some of the messages that came out of talking to all the people that you're surrounded with who have been through the same, I'll call it a crisis moment, because having your house on fire, losing everything, I mean, that's extremely traumatic. And were their lives lost in that fire? Were their animals lost? I'm not sure how big that fire was.
You know, that brings up a whole nother interesting discussion of, you know, these disasters versus disasters where lives are lost. Only one life was lost in this whole. It was a miracle that there weren't more. A lot of horses were lost, and there was obviously a lot of material devastation.
Yeah.
And but you know, some of the things that early on when I was doing Faces in the Fire, some of my first lessons in this was, you know, how denial is like such a functioning part of, it's almost healthy in a certain way when certain things are happening, but it becomes a detriment after a while. And time again, when I've talked to survivors, and particularly when I learned from Faces in the Fire, nobody believed the fire would get to them. Nobody believed the fire would be that big. And it would actually affect them. So you go into this kind of denial stage, which allows you to kind of operate, but it also takes you away from the situation of like what's actually happening. And then flash forward to some of the 9/11 survivors that I'm working with now, it was the same thing. I mean, even though everything's on fire and this building's falling apart, there was particularly one of the survivors, Becky, in the film, she just couldn't, you have a hard time fathoming what's going on when you're in a severe disaster like that. And that's one takeaway that when I first learned, you know, when I was working in Faces in the Fire and then in subsequent films.
So going back to my question was, were there any common themes that you saw through working with the people that were going through the crisis?
You know, yeah, you know, it's a classic 5 stages of grief that you see.
Yeah.
And people deal with those differently. And, you know, what's fascinating for me is there's a commonality to all of our healing. You know, that shock, and then the anger, then the bargaining, and you see that kind of happen and play out. But unfortunately, some people get stuck in some of those phases by not expressing themselves and not really moving efficiently through some of their healing, opening up other channels of like being able to talk to people and things. So the commonality I see is the classic stages of grief, and everybody basically has the same healing, but it happens at different rates, and then sometimes it actually doesn't happen at all, because then people become mired in things like my drinking was like mired me, and I was stuck in a stage of my grief recovery, if that makes sense. But I didn't really answer your question.
No, that does make sense. So what would you say to somebody who has experienced some kind of grief or loss, or it's stuck in their current situation, but wanting to expand out, wanting to move ahead with their life, who don't quite know where to start or why they're not moving forward?
You know what? That's super clear to me. Is one of the biggest things for a survivor, for somebody that has been through a traumatic incident, has been through a grief kind of incident, whatever it is to find somebody else similar to yourself, a group or an individual where you can connect and realize that you're not alone. Because the worst thing a survivor and a trauma survivor can do is isolate. Because then isolation builds on isolation and loneliness builds on loneliness. And then that's where like suicidal thoughts start to flourish and things like that. But identification with others and connecting with others is probably one of the biggest things I can tell somebody that is looking for recovery, no matter what kind of recovery it is, actually, is go find a group similar to yourself. And it's really hard because, I mean, our mechanisms, my brain is telling me nobody else is like me. I'm so unique in this, and I'm scared to like really connect. But once you connect and open up with other people and you start sharing, and it's, oh, you too? Oh my gosh, I'm not alone. And then that like sigh of relief happens, you know? So there's a moment in my film, Homecoming: A Vietnam Vet's Journey, where one of the Vietnam vets said that, he said the most beautiful words he ever heard were, "I understand."
Yeah.
And so it's like it's a commonality, that identification, it sets off, it's like lighting the fuse to recovery. It's like, oh, there's other people like me, and it gives you a second just to relax your shoulders and be like, okay, and then the next steps can be taken.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about surrounding ourselves, isn't it? So how is life today? How are you doing today? That's obviously spurred on quite a bit of interest in the films, and that's progressing nicely. Do you feel in control of your life? Do you feel like you're doing what you want to be doing?
You know, it's interesting. Spiritually, it seems like every level you get your challenges, and but my life right now is very blessed, but it's just a constant progression, 24 hours at a time for me. And it's waking up and allowing basically my higher power, which I prefer to call God, to direct me in my day. And so if I'm willing to let go of my personal will, then things start to happen in my life and things start to grow from that. And so, yeah, right now it's amazing. I'm very excited about my new film, Unmasking Hope. There's a big interest in it as a series now, which would be very powerful. Could get to a way larger audience.
Yeah.
And the family's great, and but it's not without going back to the fire. What I learned from the fire, the main thing I learned from the fire was what seemingly is one of the worst things that could possibly happen to you. If you just wait long enough, there's a reason for it. And it's the same with parenting. It's the same with marriage. And it's just hanging in there in the meantime and taking it a day at a time, and then taking yourself sometimes completely out of the equation, so things can happen and things can move forward. So does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. And I totally agree. I believe in everything, every hardship. I talk about the gift of crisis, that it might not be in the moment, and that in the moment it's really tough and really hard and really painful. But if we can just allow a little bit of time to heal and come to terms, I suppose, with what's happening, what's going on, and then we start to understand what we have control of. So the tiny little aspects, what is that little 1 degree of change that I can influence my current decision? And then it goes from there, really. So I totally agree with what you're saying. I think my question for you is, it goes back to people who don't know how to get started. You've talked about surrounding yourself with people. How much do you think is about action, and how much do you think is about mindset?
Oh my, you know, that's interesting. Mindset versus action. You know, I'm very actually kind of tipping towards the action kind of thing, because then the mindset follows action. And you know, they say that you can act your way into right thinking, but you can't think yourself into right acting.
Yeah, that's
So
a good one.
it's that classic fake it till you make it. And
Mm,
it's not putting up a fake front saying everything's okay. It's a very subtle thing of, okay, if I want to achieve this and be this, then I have to start taking the actions to be that. And
mm,
it kind of feels uncomfortable at first, and you start
mm,
doing that, and then the mind follows, and then that mindset starts to click in.
mm,
And again, with recovery, especially recovery from drugs and alcohol, I work with a lot of newcomers, as they say, and they're very uncomfortable, and it's like I go back to the fake it till you make it.
mm,
Take that action. What's the action that you're going to take? Prayer is great, but actually I believe God is waiting for us on the other end of action. He wants us to show up.
mm.
One of my great mentors tells me, you can be in a closet and pray for a hot dog, but it's not going to show up.
Yeah, it's really good, isn't it? You've got to go and get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So you talk a little bit, you have mentioned God and your spiritual beliefs kind of briefly on the side there. How significant are they to your life? And do you have a moment where you talked about how you had nothing in your life and you were starting to think that you needed to tap into your spiritual side? Are you happy to talk about that for a little bit?
Oh, I would love to. Yeah.
So what happened there? Was there a moment when you spiritually woke up, or did you actually start to tap into that part of life and see what was there, or what instigated that change to be able to be living in that way?
That's a great question. And, I think I've always had a God consciousness, and
Mm,
and I grew up in what you would call religion, I guess, church and around stuff like that. And I always had a God consciousness, but not a working relationship with
mm,
what I would call my higher power, God. And so what happened is, early on in my sobriety and just coming out of that, part of the program that I'm involved in is, a belief in higher power and letting go and giving that power to him. And so at some point when I was passing through that phase of my program, I remember going out to dinner with my wife, and I'm talking about this, and I'm so excited about this newfound idea of this spirituality, that this wind, I kind of had this epiphany, this wind kind of blew through me at that time, and while we're out to dinner, and I just got the sense that I was able to go back to my core again, that person that I was kind of born to be, that I was before the drugs and alcohol got into the mix. That
mm,
kid that was doing the movies around 7 years old. And so that was like kind of my epiphany and and my introduction to this, that I had this second chance. But not only that, with my program, what I call my program for my recovery, I mean, I I am constantly relying, if I do his work, which means put myself out to others, help others,
mm,
then he's going to help me and keep that obsession alcohol away from me. And so far it's worked for 28 years.
mm,
And so it's a very real working relationship. It's not a deal. It's
mm.
like I made. It's just a working relationship. I have a daily reprieve based upon my spiritual condition, and I have to exercise that and take and operate and make sure my spiritual condition is in good shape.
Mm. Does that get tough sometimes?
Yeah, because because all these, being human, um, it's not like the obsession comes back and attacks me with the alcoholism or anything like that. It's
Yeah.
that my thinking can fall back, and that's why I have a mentorship situation where I do check in with a lot of other men
Yeah.
to make sure that I'm still on course. Because what happens is, it just, my thinking stops working correctly. I don't get clear, and I need to
Yeah.
run things by other people.
Yeah. Yeah. That can happen.
Particularly,
Sorry,
go
go
ahead.
on. There you go.
Particularly, my mentorship, particularly men that are older, that have been there, that have walked the path, that are also followers
Yeah.
of that have God in their life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. So then what sort of things do you have in your life today to keep you in that driver's seat and to keep you in a position where you are living your best life and going ahead the way that you want to, rather than falling back to those addictions or things you don't want in your life.
Well, it breaks down into three things. One is, I mentioned this, is a mentorship program that I have. It's
Yeah.
not really even a program. I have always had a strong male mentor in my life that I allow to speak into my life. My particular mentor I have right now, he's 82 years old.
Oh,
He's an
wow.
amazing man. And I'm able to allow him to speak into me. And I try to see him at least once or twice a week, talk to him on the phone.
Yeah.
And he is my mentor, and he knows that. And
Yeah.
so he can call me on my stuff. And when my marriage gets tough or something like we talk about that, and from his perspective, I get to talk to somebody that's walked that path before. So that's one thing. The other is I like fellowship, and particularly other men that are going through my same situation. I like I go to meetings with them, and I have men's meetings, and I like to share and connect, and then I don't get lost in thinking I'm alone at all with that. Then the other thing is I need to give this stuff away. So I help other men that are going through the same situation, particularly in recovery. But also, now this is an amazing thing, through my films and having went through the fire, I get to help all these other people, these veterans and these 9/11 survivors and all these people in my film. I form a very special bond with them. And so we help each other. And so it's pretty rich.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it. I love the connection to people and just how much strength we can gain from each other and give to each other. I just think it's amazing when we're able to be open and vulnerable, just the impact that can have in our lives.
Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting you mentioned that, because this is a pet peeve of mine, and I don't want to go too far off on this pet peeve, but I really believe that the incidence of divorce and violence, domestic violence and alcoholism, or all sorts of other societal ills, particularly with males. And, I'm 50 something years old, and I see a lot of families self-destructing. And I really believe if these men would take 2 seconds and find somebody in their life that they trust, that's older than them, that could guide them and open up a little bit so they can communicate how they're feeling instead of operating as a sole male based upon their quote instincts, I think we'd have a lot healthier society. And it's just I can tell you now, without these great men that I've had in my life, I don't know what my marriage would be like. I don't know what my parenting would be like. I don't know what my work would be like.
Exactly. You talk about how important hope is to the healing journey, and I understand that you've made extra movies following the fire one.
Mm-hmm.
What are you hoping to see out of these movies? Are you seeing healing directly as a result of making them? Is it the people who are in them, the people that are watching them? Talk to us a little bit around the idea of hope being part of the healing journey.
That's such a great question, because there's two sides to what happens with my films. Is one side is for say you're watching a veteran in one of my films going through his trials and his traumas. One side of this is the viewers watching this, and it becomes awareness to the viewer. They're not connected with any military situation or anything like that. They don't even know, they might not even know a soldier, but they're connecting on an empathetic level through their empathy with the soldier and the things that he's going through. And then it brings awareness. To me, empathy is a huge tool, and it's a huge thing that we need more of. So you're watching the soldier go, oh, I can understand that. It's not my same situation, but I can understand what he's going through. That's empathy. And then it becomes an awareness. Then it translates into a form of tolerance later in society. So you're out there and you see a vet, and you heard, oh, why don't they just get over this PTSD thing, whatever it is. But you've seen this and you have this empathy. So you have this tolerance then towards this individual. And it can be a veteran, it can be sexual trauma, it can be a first responder. A lot of people say, why don't these 9/11 survivors just get over this thing? But it becomes, once you see that and connect on an empathetic level, it becomes awareness that equals tolerance. On another level, my films, say, going back to the veteran example, it's a veteran watching the film, and they see the thing, and they see his life journey, they see his or her life journey, and then they go, wow, me too. And then it's identification. Then they see the path that these individuals take towards healing, and they go, wow, I have an opportunity to get out of where I'm at, which is hope. And so many times I have great stories of people that have seen the films, and then what we were talking about earlier, have taken the action because they've seen it aspirationally portrayed in the film, and they go, well, he can do it, he's just like me. So I have some amazing stories. So that's kind of the two sides that happen with my films, and that's what's so exciting about being able to do what I do with my work.
That is exciting to see the change that's going to come from the future as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what is in the future for you? What's next for you?
What's next is, actually, I'm pretty excited, is going back one film, Searching for a Home, Coming Back from War, which you can find on iTunes and Google Play and wherever. It was on also on public television here. It was extremely successful on public television and on video on demand, and with over 2,300 showings on television.
Wow.
So that's when we developed UnMASKing HOPE. And UnMASKing HOPE has 9/11 survivors, not just veterans, 9/11 survivors. It does have veterans. It has first responders. It has sexual abuse survivors. It has mass shooting survivors. And so we tried to broaden our audience with UnMASKing HOPE. So what the exciting thing about that now is, I think this message is of hope and this unity of healing, and all these different mental health issues and things like that are coming to a head. And I think there is a lot of interest in UnMASKing HOPE, and we're very excited about turning it into a series so we can then actually reach out and affect more lives than we would if we were just doing a singular film.
Yeah.
So that's what we're working on right now, and I'm very excited about that. I'm excited about all the people I get to meet doing this, that the connections, but more importantly, I'm excited about spreading the word of hope and empathy by portraying all these different situations and traumas, and then showing that there is I call it a sober hope. You know, it's not just a sparkly, everything will be fine hope. It's a sober hope, because no matter what, when you went through trauma, it plays a part in your life, but there is hope underneath that, a real hope. And as I say, not just a fairy tale hope, but a real hope of recovery. And there's going to be different situations you run into and everything, but there's hope. And that's what I'm trying to portray with UnMASKing HOPE and get to the biggest audience possible.
And when is that coming out?
You know, we're actually in meetings right now, and the best way to find out about what's happening with the film is to go to unmaskinghopethemmovie.com.
Okay.
And we hopefully in a few months we already have the first couple pilots shot, and so hopefully in a few months we'll be going into full production on it.
Oh, excellent. And we will put all the links to that for the listeners and the viewers, so they can access that. Eric Christiansen, thank you so much. I love what you're doing. I love that we're doing, or I'd like to think that we're doing something quite similar, except I've got no movie making skills. So, you know, I'm getting out there talking to people who've been through their crisis moments, been through the hardship and the hope that comes out of those moments. And like I said earlier, it doesn't necessarily happen at the time or straight away. It can be years later. But how in every hard experience, there's opportunity and there's challenge. And if we can challenge our challenges, we can just create such a more promising future. So Eric, thank you for coming on. We wish you all the best with your filmmaking. I'm super excited to go and watch some of these movies. So yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. I appreciate it so much.
So if you've enjoyed this episode of the Let's Talk Life Design podcast, I would love your support to help me get these messages and conversations out there. It would mean a whole lot to me if you could either share the podcast with your friends and family, or if you could link to the podcast homepage over at letstalklifedesign.com. I really appreciate you joining me and your support as I talk to amazing guests on our show. My heart is really that I would be a channel for others to get their messages out there, to inspire our listeners to live their best life and to learn how to implement these life design principles. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll catch you soon, where we'll uncover more strategies and steps to designing that life that we love.